There's a specific moment worth tracing carefully, one distinct from the general breakdown we've examined extensively throughout previous conversations in this series. This isn't simply about losing access to supply, losing narrative control, or losing predictive competence. It's something narrower and considerably more specific. The moment his psychology genuinely, however briefly, registers exactly what quality of connection existed with you and exactly why nothing subsequent has managed to replicate it. Today, we're going to trace exactly what he actually lost, why this specific realization proves so difficult for his psychology to fully process, and why understanding it protects you from a specific misreading that could otherwise distort how you interpret this eventual reckoning. Let's start with precisely defining what he actually lost, because accuracy here matters enormously for understanding why this realization, when it eventually occurs, proves so genuinely destabilizing. What he actually lost. Not love in the mature, reciprocal sense, but access to genuine emotional depth he could receive without ever having to reciprocate it in kind. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the crucial distinction between attention and love, examined extensively in our earlier conversation about why narcissists need attention more than love. What existed in this relationship from his side was never genuine, mature love in the way you likely experienced and offered it. But this doesn't mean he lost nothing significant. Remember what we established about how his psychology genuinely depends on external material for stability, considerably more sophisticated material than most sources of supply typically provide. What he actually lost was access to exactly this specific quality, genuine emotional depth, offered generously and consistently, that required nothing equivalent in return in order to keep flowing. Here's why this distinction matters enormously for understanding the eventual breaking point we're tracing throughout today's conversation. He's not grieving lost love in the mature sense, because his psychological architecture never developed the capacity to genuinely give or receive this kind of love in the first place. What he's actually grieving, once genuine grief eventually surfaces, is the loss of a specific, rare resource, someone capable of providing genuine emotional richness without requiring the reciprocal vulnerability his psychology could never actually offer in return. Here's why nothing subsequent successfully replaces this specific loss, connecting to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about supply diversification and comparison anxiety. Remember what we established about how new partners typically fail to provide the same regulation and stability, at least initially, because they haven't yet developed the trained responsiveness that took considerable time to build with you. What we're adding here matters directly. Even if a new partner eventually develops similar responsiveness, she's unlikely to bring exactly the specific combination of qualities that made your particular version of this dynamic so uniquely valuable. The specific depth of feeling, the specific quality of perception, the specific generosity that characterized exactly what you offered throughout the relationship. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this specific loss proves so difficult for his psychology to fully process, even during moments of genuine temporary crisis. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural incapacity for sustained self-reflection. Fully processing this specific loss would require him to genuinely acknowledge something his psychology is specifically built to avoid confronting: that he received something rare and valuable, that he failed to honor it appropriately, and that this failure, not simply bad luck or incompatible circumstances, is precisely what produced its permanent absence from his life. This acknowledgement requires exactly the kind of integrated self-concept, holding both "I am fundamentally capable" and "I failed significantly," that we've traced throughout this entire series as structurally unavailable to genuine narcissistic psychology. Here's why this creates a specific, painful bind worth understanding directly. He can sense, at some level, that something valuable is missing, that subsequent relationships fail to provide something this one genuinely offered. But he typically cannot access the full, accurate explanation for why this absence persists, because that explanation requires exactly the self-accountability his psychology cannot sustain. This produces something worth naming directly: partial, fragmentary awareness of loss, without the complete integrated understanding that would actually allow this awareness to resolve into anything resembling genuine growth or genuine change. Let's trace what this partial, fragmentary awareness actually looks like in practice, because understanding its specific, incomplete quality reveals something important about why this breaking point, even when it genuinely occurs, rarely produces the comprehensive transformation someone in your position might hope to eventually witness. Here's the first manifestation worth understanding, connecting directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what actually happens in a narcissist's mind after the discard. Remember the selective memory intrusion we examined, specific moments resurfacing unbidden, carrying emotional weight he cannot fully suppress. With this specific breaking point, these intrusions often carry a particular quality worth naming directly. Not simply generic nostalgia, but specific, vivid recall of moments when your particular depth of feeling, your particular quality of perception, produced something he cannot locate anywhere else in his subsequent experience. A specific conversation where you understood something about him he'd never articulated to anyone else. A specific moment of comfort that felt different from anything a subsequent partner has managed to provide. Here's why these specific, vivid memories prove so genuinely disorienting, connecting to everything we traced throughout our conversation about comparison anxiety. Remember what we established about how new relationships often produce unconscious benchmarking against what previous partners provided. This specific breaking point intensifies this benchmarking considerably, because the specific quality being missed, genuine depth without required reciprocity, proves considerably harder to locate or replicate than the more generic forms of validation and attention that ordinary supply diversification can often provide reasonably successfully. Here's the second manifestation worth understanding, one that often surfaces as a specific uncomfortable pattern in subsequent relationships. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about attention versus love, the way his engagement typically calibrates according to his own internal state, rather than genuine curiosity about a partner's inner world. This specific breaking point sometimes produces a brief, uncharacteristic shift in this pattern. Momentary attempts at genuine curiosity, genuine effort to access the kind of depth he received from you, applied clumsily and inconsistently toward a new partner who likely doesn't understand what's actually being attempted or why it feels so unfamiliar coming from him. Here's what's worth understanding about why these attempts typically fail to sustain themselves, connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural, rather than simply reluctant, nature of his psychological limitations. Genuine depth of the kind you offered wasn't simply a technique he could observe and then replicate through conscious effort. It required exactly the kind of internal capacity, genuine self-trust, genuine emotional sophistication, genuine willingness to be vulnerable without immediately requiring reciprocal validation, that his psychology never developed and that momentary, motivated effort cannot manufacture quickly, regardless of how genuinely he might temporarily wish to access it. Here's the third manifestation worth understanding, connecting directly to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the 4 signs revealing genuine private guilt. This specific breaking point sometimes produces a particular kind of comparison, spoken or unspoken, that reveals genuine awareness without genuine accountability. Comments to friends or new partners that inadvertently reference what he's missing, framed in ways that avoid any acknowledgement of his own role in losing access to it. I don't think I've ever really connected with anyone the way I thought I did once. This kind of comment reveals genuine, if fragmentary, awareness of loss, while simultaneously avoiding the specific acknowledgement that his own behavior specifically caused this loss that would actually constitute meaningful accountability. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this fragmentary awareness, however genuine, typically doesn't produce lasting behavioral change, even when it does surface clearly. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the gap between insight and integration. Even genuine recognition that something valuable was lost doesn't automatically translate into the specific self-examination, recognizing his own role, recognizing the specific pattern that produced the loss, developing genuine commitment to changing that pattern that would actually be required to prevent the same loss from recurring in future relationships. Awareness without accountability typically produces exactly what we've traced throughout this series as the most common outcome: genuine, temporary discomfort, followed by whatever combination of narrative reconstruction and supply diversification allows this discomfort to eventually, incompletely resolve. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply an examination of his fragmentary awareness without addressing what genuinely matters most. How to interpret this breaking point accurately, and why understanding it precisely protects you from a specific misreading that could otherwise cost you something significant in your own continued healing. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly, connecting to a distinction we established carefully in Part 1. He's not grieving lost love in the mature sense, and understanding this precisely protects you from a specific, tempting misinterpretation. The belief that this breaking point, if it genuinely occurs, somehow retroactively proves the relationship was something more genuine than everything this entire series has established. It actually was. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural difference between attention-seeking dependency and genuine, mature love. His eventual awareness of loss, however genuine within its own limited scope, doesn't transform what happened into something it never actually was. It simply confirms that even attention-dependent psychology can recognize, however incompletely, when a particular source of that attention proved unusually rich and unusually difficult to replace. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about why this precision matters for your own healing specifically. If you interpret his eventual breaking point as confirmation that he really did love me after all, you risk reopening exactly the kind of hope this entire series has spent so much effort helping you release. The hope that somewhere beneath the structural limitations we've traced so extensively, genuine capacity for the relationship you actually deserved was present all along, simply waiting for the right circumstances to finally emerge. This hope, however understandable, misunderstands what this breaking point actually represents. It represents recognition of loss within his existing psychological structure, not evidence that this structure was ever actually capable of the mature reciprocity genuine love requires. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that offers something genuinely valuable to take from this entire conversation, despite this important caveat. What his eventual fragmentary awareness actually confirms, accurately and completely, is something worth holding with genuine pride. The depth and quality of what you offered throughout this relationship was real, rare, and genuinely difficult to replace, even by someone whose psychological structure makes genuine reciprocation of that depth structurally impossible. This confirmation doesn't require reinterpreting what he offered as more genuine than it was. It simply accurately confirms what you offered, independent of whether he was ever capable of receiving it the way it deserved to be received. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Whether he ever reaches this specific breaking point, whether it produces the fragmentary awareness we've traced throughout today's conversation, whether it ever becomes visible to you at all, none of this changes what you already completely know about your own worth and your own capacity for genuine connection. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about your own healing developing independently of any confirmation from his side. This specific breaking point, however genuinely it might eventually occur, was never actually the validation your own healing needed to depend on. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation: what he actually lost. Genuine access to your particular depth, your particular perception, your particular generous capacity for connection represents something worth understanding, not primarily as his tragedy, but as accurate confirmation of exactly who you actually are, capacities that remain fully, completely intact and available to be offered to someone genuinely capable of receiving and reciprocating them, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen inside his own limited, structurally incomplete recognition of everything he forfeited. You don't need his breaking point in order to know your own worth. You don't need his fragmentary awareness in order to trust the genuine depth you're capable of offering. What he lost belongs to his own limited story, one that will likely never resolve into the comprehensive accountability that would actually honor what he received. Your own capacity for genuine connection, genuine depth, genuine love remains entirely, completely yours, available now to be offered to someone whose psychological architecture, unlike his, was actually built to receive and return it in kind. Someone who exists, who is capable of exactly the reciprocity his structure never allowed, and who deserves exactly the depth you're fully, genuinely capable of giving freely and completely to someone finally worthy of receiving it. There's one more dimension worth adding here because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward from this entire conversation. How do you actually protect yourself from the specific temptation this breaking point creates, particularly if evidence of it happens to reach you directly through his own words, through mutual connections, or through some other channel that makes his fragmentary awareness genuinely, undeniably visible? This question deserves honest, practical examination because understanding the concept intellectually doesn't automatically protect you from its emotional pull if you actually encounter it in real lived circumstances. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine, hard-won discernment can still be tested by circumstances specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to activate old hope. If his breaking point becomes visible to you directly, perhaps through a message that finally, seemingly acknowledges what he lost, perhaps through second-hand reports of him speaking about you with what sounds like genuine regret, the practical protection worth applying connects directly to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about distinguishing genuine, sustained accountability from momentary, fragmentary awareness. Remember the technique we examined extensively that produces apology-shaped words without producing comprehensive change. This same distinction applies here. Momentary recognition of loss, however genuinely felt in the instant it's expressed, differs categorically from the sustained, demonstrated transformation that would actually indicate something structurally different has developed in his capacity for relationship. Here's a practical question worth asking yourself if you ever encounter evidence of this breaking point directly. Is this awareness accompanied by any genuine, sustained change in how he treats people currently in his life, or does it remain confined to words about you specifically, unconnected to any demonstrated shift in his actual, ongoing behavior? Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between insight and integration. Genuine, sustained transformation would show up in how he currently treats a new partner, a colleague, a family member, not simply in retrospective nostalgic language about what he lost with you specifically. If his apparent awareness remains confined entirely to backward-looking regret without any forward-looking evidence of actual behavioral change, this suggests exactly the fragmentary, unintegrated awareness we've traced throughout today's conversation, rather than anything resembling the comprehensive transformation that would make renewed trust or renewed hope genuinely warranted. Here's something worth understanding about why this specific distinction matters so significantly for protecting your own continued healing. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how hope, even hope activated by seemingly compelling evidence, tends to reliably disappoint when it's built on momentary awareness rather than sustained, demonstrated change. If you encounter evidence of his breaking point and find genuine hope beginning to activate, use exactly this question. Is there sustained, current evidence of actual behavioral transformation or simply backward-looking regret? As a practical, reliable check against exactly the kind of premature hope this entire series has spent so much effort helping you release. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. One that addresses something important about the relationship between this specific breaking point and your own continued life, regardless of whether it ever occurs, regardless of whether you ever witness it, regardless of how it eventually resolves on his side of a story that no longer requires your continued narration. The genuine value of understanding everything we've traced throughout today's discussion isn't primarily about equipping you to interpret his eventual reaction correctly, valuable as that protection genuinely is. It's about something considerably more significant, confirming, with complete clarity and complete accuracy, exactly what you're actually capable of offering, exactly what genuine depth and genuine connection you carry within yourself, entirely independent of whether the specific person who once received it ever fully recognized or fully honored its value. This is ultimately the most important thing to carry forward from this entire conversation. His breaking point, whether it happens, whether you witness it, whether it ever resolves into anything resembling genuine accountability, was never actually the point of understanding any of this. The actual point, the thing worth genuinely internalizing and carrying forward into every future relationship you'll ever build, is this. You possess genuine capacity for depth, for connection, for the kind of generous, sophisticated emotional richness that proved genuinely, uniquely difficult to replace, even by someone whose psychology guaranteed he'd fail to recognize its value until it was already permanently gone. This capacity remains entirely yours, undiminished by his failure to honor it, ready to be offered fully and freely to someone whose own psychological architecture was actually built to receive it, appreciate it, and offer genuine reciprocity in return. That person exists. And when you eventually find them, everything you're capable of offering, everything he lost, and everything this entire conversation has traced throughout his own limited, incomplete recognition of that loss, will finally, genuinely land somewhere it can actually be received, appreciated, and returned in kind, exactly as it always deserved to be.